The first rule on investment is don't lose. And the second rule on investment is don't forget the first rule, and that's all the rules there are. I mean, if you buy things for far below what they're worth, and you buy a group of them, you basically don't lose money. Wow. Warren Buffett is reportedly worth over $100 billion. From a shy boy selling Coca-Cola door-to-door to molding Berkshire Hathaway into a billion-dollar empire, the Oracle of Omaha has remained as one of the richest men in the world. But what makes him so unique among the wealthy is that he didn't inherit his fortune, nor did he acquire it by innovating technology, but rather he grew his wealth by winning consistently in the stock market. So how did he do it? What did he do differently where so many others have failed? In this video, we're going to learn how Warren Buffett beat the stock market and became a self-made investment billionaire, starting from the very beginning. Warren Buffett was born in Omaha, Nebraska, in August of 1930, just 1 year after the Great Depression hit the country. In his early childhood, he noticed how people struggled to make a living due to the severe economic crisis, and quickly learned about the importance of money. Luckily, his father was a smart businessman, and although he had recently lost his job from a local bank, he used what little savings he had to open his own company selling stocks and bonds, and from this was able to provide enough for his family. Growing up, Warren was a shy and quiet boy who spent most of his childhood alone, often reading books from his father's library, and it was from this library where he developed an early obsession with investing and the game of business. Eager to put his new knowledge to use, he approached his grandfather, who owned a local grocery store, and asked him if he could provide Warren with drinks so that he could go and sell them around the neighborhood. His grandfather agreed, and so, at the young age of 6, Warren started his first business selling Coca-Cola door-to-door and making 5 cents for every 6-pack. He soon added a few more items to his small business, and just a year later, Warren was selling chewing gum, magazines, and Coca-Cola while making a decent profit for himself. By the time he was just 11, the boy used all of his savings to buy his first stock, purchasing 3 shares for himself in an oil and gas company called Cities Service, with each stock valued at $38.25. But shortly after buying them, their value dropped to around $27 per share. Despite the anxiety he felt, he held on tight and waited until their value rose to $40 before selling them. Although he had successfully turned a profit, he noticed that those same shares later shot up to over $200. The news of his missed opportunity stung, but it taught him an important lesson. 75 years have gone by, and I've never known what the market is going to do the next day. That's not my game. My game is to decide whether I'm in the right economy, and by owning good companies for long periods of time. These experiences and mistakes helped young Warren become much wiser than the average boy his age. A few years later, his father was elected to serve his first term as a U.S. congressman. And as a result, the whole Buffett family moved from Omaha to Washington, D.C. There, Warren Buffett would get his first real job at the age of 14, delivering newspapers for the Washington Post. However, he wasn't satisfied with the money he earned, so he took another job with one of their competitors, the Times-Herald, and began delivering the newspapers simultaneously, earning $179 per month, which would be just over $3,000 in today's currency. Buffett later used his earnings and savings to buy a pinball machine with a friend of his and installed it at a barber shop. Soon after, they bought 2 more pinball machines, and at the end of each week, they would split the profits between themselves and the owners who ran the shop. They later sold their machines for $1,200, and with the money earned, Warren Buffett bought his first property, a 40-acre plot of land in Nebraska. The craziest thing about all of this was that Warren was just 15 when he bought the farm. Even at his young age, it was clear that this boy from Omaha was on to something big. After graduating from high school in 1947, Buffett was eager to begin his life as a full-time stockbroker. However, his father wanted him to go to college, and so Warren enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania and was able to pay for his studies with the earnings from his Nebraska farmland, which he rented out. After obtaining his bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Nebraska, he was later rejected by Harvard when he applied for his master's degree. This rejection, however, turned out to be a blessing in disguise, leading him to enroll at the Columbia Business School, where he met a teacher who would change his life, Benjamin Graham. Benjamin Graham was an economist and investor whose work and writings Buffett was already familiar with. In fact, the same year that they met, Graham had just published one of the most famous books of his career, The Intelligent Investor. In simple terms, the book was a step-by-step guide on how to invest successfully and consistently without speculating by buying stocks that were undervalued. Warren quickly became one of Benjamin Graham's best students, and according to Buffett, Graham would go on to become one of the most influential men in his life after his father. After receiving his master's degree in economics, Buffett was eager to kickstart his career and yearned to work near the headquarters of the biggest investment firms in the country and home of the historic New York Stock Exchange, Wall Street. However, one major problem stood in his way. Despite his wealth of knowledge in business management and investing, Warren Buffett was still an introverted 21-year-old who couldn't present himself as the charismatic business tycoon he's become today. He was terrified of talking to new people, and at times would even throw up out of pure nervousness. Nevertheless, he summoned the courage and signed up for a public speaking course, and that move turned out to be one of the best investments he ever made. Investing in yourself is the best thing you can do. The more you learn, the more you earn. Not too long after, Benjamin Graham contacted Buffett and offered him a job at his investing firm in New York, to which the young man gladly agreed. There, he mastered the art of security analysis, learning how to see the real value of a company based on their balance sheets. But while Graham and Buffett shared a mutual respect for each other, the differences in their philosophies soon became obvious. Buffett was more interested in understanding how companies worked and believed that the company's management should be part of the investment decision process. But Graham disagreed. Graham was more concerned with the company's numbers and balance sheets, and it didn't help matters that he was also a difficult man to work with, expecting strict compliance to the conventional rules of investing, which Buffett's young mind was constantly questioning. But ultimately, their disagreements wouldn't matter, because by 1956, Warren Buffett was on his own after Graham decided to retire and shut down the partnership. Nevertheless, the young man had built up his savings from $9,800 to $175,000. And more importantly, he gained first-hand experience running a New York investment firm. He was now ready to establish his own partnership, making those who invested in him into millionaires, while also transforming himself into one of the wealthiest people in the world. In 1956, at the age of 25, Buffett returned to Omaha and started his own partnership called Buffett Associates Limited. Despite having more than enough money to rent an office space and hire some staff, Warren instead chose to use one of the bedrooms of his house and manage the business himself. He got some of his friends and family to invest a total of $105,000, and immediately after, he kick-started his partnership. Influenced by his master, Graham, Warren Buffett began investing in undervalued stocks, but took its philosophy to the extreme by dealing with terrible performing companies that were ready to go bankrupt, buying them so cheap that even their liquidation value was worth more. This strategy is what he calls the cigar butt. Anyone who picks up discarded cigars on the street can enjoy a few puffs, which would cost him nothing. Cigar butt investing runs along that same line. You find a terribly undervalued stock that sells for so cheap, you know for a fact it is worth more, and after selling it at its appropriate price, the initial bargain purchase makes the puff all free. This method proved to be a masterstroke for Buffett, And over the next 6 years of his business, his partnership's net worth increased from a $105,000 venture to a $7.2 million foundation. As his portfolio began to grow, so did the number of people who wanted to join. However, most of them never ended up partnering with him because they couldn't trust an 18-year-old looking kid to manage all their money by himself. And they were right. Warren Buffett still had the looks of a teenager, despite being in his late 20s, and for more than 5 years, he conducted his business all alone, writing all the checks, filing the tax returns, and taking delivery on stocks, causing many potential clients to doubt him. But for those who were bold enough to invest in him, they would see their portfolios rise, averaging a 29.5% compound annual return from 1956 to 1969, outperforming the stock market by a factor of 4. 10 years into his partnership, Warren Buffett was managing over $44 million in assets. And just 3 years later, these numbers shot up to an astonishing $104 million. However, while the market was booming and his partners were very happy with the return on their investments, there was one thing that Buffett worried about: the rising stock prices. There's a motto that Warren Buffett lives by that has always served him well. Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. You see, it became difficult for him to keep making his cigar-butt investments in an overvalued stock market, and was well aware that the bull market they were experiencing would soon be coming to an end. He found it too risky to continue investing with other people's money, and so, by the end of 1969, he made the big decision to dissolve the business altogether and let his partners go. Still, he had built his own fortune all the way to $25 million by the age of 39, and he was ready to make his next move, turning Berkshire Hathaway into a billion-dollar empire. Now, to amass such a fortune, smart investors like Warren Buffett know how to utilize uncertain times to their advantage. And it's no secret that we are definitely in uncertain times, with inflation hitting a 40-year high, and nearly 70% of economists surveyed by the Financial Times predicting a recession next year. But institutions like Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway may already be prepared, because earlier this year, Bank of America's chief strategist recommended investors look at real assets like art as inflation heats up. Even Bloomberg has reported that art can serve as an inflation hedge in almost any environment, because the last time inflation was this high, in the late 70s through the early 80s, art had an average yearly appreciation of 33%. According to Masterworks All Art Index, which is higher than gold and real estate, the traditional inflation hedges during that same period, which is why Masterworks has seen increased demand this year. Masterworks allows anyone to invest in multi-million-dollar contemporary artworks to hedge against inflation and potentially recoup some returns. Because since their inception, Masterworks has sold 5 paintings with an average net return of 26.8% to their investors. Legally, I have to add that past performance is not indicative of future results. But that's during a bear market, rising inflation, and continued uncertainty. With no end to inflation in sight, the demand for Masterworks remains high, and there is a wait list. But you can skip it just by clicking on the link in the description. Berkshire Hathaway was a struggling textile company destined to fail. Its stocks were trading at around $7 in 1965, but its assets were worth at least $11. Naturally, Warren purchased a lot of shares in the company as a cigar butt, $7.50 each, and 3 years later, he arranged a deal with the owner to sell his shares at $11.50. But when the final offer came, the owner tried to cheat Warren by buying his shares at $11.37. This infuriated Buffett. So in return, he bought out the whole company and fired him. Although he got his revenge, Buffett now found himself stuck, owning a company on the decline. But instead of letting his investment go to waste, he decided to phase Berkshire Hathaway out of the textile industry. and use it instead as a holding firm to make his investments. However, his recent bad experience buying undervalued stocks had given Buffett pause to rethink his investment strategy. Luckily, one of his good business partners, Charlie Munger, influenced him to change his philosophy from buying fair companies at great prices to great companies at fair prices. And that decision turned out to be another turning point in Warren Buffett's career. He began searching for companies that he believed had an economic moat. The word moat, in this sense, refers to a company's ability to maintain a competitive advantage over the rest of the industry and still maintain its market share. One example of this is Coca-Cola. Whenever you think about soft drinks, Coca-Cola will most likely come to mind. It's a brand that has been around for more than a century and connected with billions of people around the world. It's an advantage Coca-Cola has that makes it harder for other brands to compete against. Using this new philosophy, Warren Buffett began buying large shares in grade A companies, such as American Express and the Washington Post, through Berkshire Hathaway, whose stock had increased from $11 per share in 1965 to over $290 by the late 1970s. By then, Buffett's personal net worth had increased to around $240 million. And yet, this new game-changing investment strategy was only a part of the reason for his growing success. What really allowed him to make his true wealth was getting into the insurance business. You see, insurance companies operate much more like banks. As people regularly pay their insurance premiums, company owners generally tend to have a great amount of cash on hand. Buffett realized he could use that cash to carefully buy and invest in a series of businesses, essentially generating even more profit from those investments. Thus, since 1967, Warren started buying up insurance businesses, starting with the National Indemnity, then followed by others such as Central States Indemnity and Geico. After tapping into billions of dollars from those insurance companies, he began purchasing shares in businesses that he believed had a moat, most notably acquiring 7% of Coca-Cola's total stock. From then on, his Berkshire's portfolio skyrocketed. So much so that by 1990, its stock was trading at around $7,000, and by the age of 60, Warren Buffett himself had a net worth over $1 billion. Over the years, Berkshire Hathaway has gone on to buy and hold shares in many grade A companies. Most recently, large banks such as Goldman Sachs and Bank of America, making Berkshire Hathaway one of the most powerful and profitable companies in the world, and Buffett himself, the richest man on earth in 2008. But even with all of his riches and achievements, Buffett still remains an astonishingly frugal man, who can be seen driving his 2014 Cadillac XTS and often eating McDonald's for breakfast. It is clear that the Oracle of Omaha is a man who has lived by his principles and integrity, but above everything, he will be remembered as the man who understood the game of business and investment better than anyone else. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to subscribe and like the video. Until then, I'll see you in the next one. In 1879, a 16-year-old boy left his father's farm bound for Detroit. At a time when the only means of transportation were trains or horse carriages, and the first automobiles were mostly seen as racing machines for the rich, this boy would later open a car company that would change the course of the automobile industry to what we know today. 35 years later, after his arrival in Detroit, half of all the cars on Earth were carrying his name. And that boy, Henry Ford, would become one of the wealthiest men in American history. This is that story. Henry Ford was born on his father's farm on the 30th of July, 1863, in what is now Dearborn, Michigan. His father, William Ford, owned a farm where everyone in the family lived and worked. And being the oldest son of 6 children, Henry was expected to take over the family's business. However, he was nothing like his father and was never interested in his business. At the time, farming was labor-intensive, slow, and rigorous. While Henry did his best to help out on the farm, he hated the sheer idea of it. "I never had any particular love for the farm. It was the mother on the farm I loved." Henry Ford. Like most kids his age, Henry didn't like going to school and never made it past the 8th grade. He preferred to learn things on his own terms, and from a young age, he became very interested in mechanics. This curiosity for machines led him to study every piece of machinery he came across. At the age of 12, his father gifted him a pocket watch, and after playing around with its movements, he learned how to take it apart and put it back together in a matter of minutes, as well as the watches of his friends and relatives. He later gained a reputation as a watch repairman and began fixing watches for people in the neighborhood. When Henry turned 13, he came across a steam engine for the first time in his life during a school trip to one of Detroit's companies, and that's when his passion for mechanics became an obsession. And for the next few years, it became his new hobby. By the time he was 15, he had constructed his first steam engine. But his life took a turn when Henry lost his mother, Mary Ford, to a sudden illness. Henry had shared a deep bond with his mother and was closer to her than anyone else on the farm. Devastated by her loss, Henry's hate for the farm intensified. He began looking for a way to escape his situation, as the farm held too many memories of his dear mother. After turning 16, and against the wishes of his father, Henry packed his things and left the village in search of a new direction in life. At the time, Detroit was rapidly becoming a city of industry, thanks to the steam engine, and the city was hungry for young engineers looking for work. It was here, in Detroit, where Henry would plunge headfirst into reinventing himself by learning everything there was to know about machines. He took a job at a streetcar manufacturing company known as Michigan Car Company Works. Unfortunately, Henry was fired only 6 days after he began. After being unemployed for some time, he found a job as an apprentice at the James Flower & Brothers machine shop, where he earned $2.60 per week. But it wasn't enough to cover his rent, so Henry made good use of his childhood obsession. He found a night job as a jeweler, cleaning and repairing watches 6 hours a night and 6 days a week for $3 weekly. Despite pulling so many jobs together to make ends meet, Henry would still study and experiment with machines whenever he had free time. In 1882, when he turned 19, Henry Ford decided to return home to Michigan. He still hated farming, so he did very little work there and spent most of his time playing and experimenting with the machines he found on the farm. Luckily enough, his father had purchased a portable steam engine, which had quickly become a norm among the farmers. Henry spent most of his time with this machine and became so good with it that a neighbor at his father's farm paid him $3 to operate his steam engine for him. And from there, Ford's talent and gift for machines spread across Michigan. Word of Henry's talent reached the district representative of the Westinghouse Engine Company of Schenectady from New York, and so the company hired him. Henry's job was to travel throughout southern Michigan, setting up and servicing Westinghouse steam tractor engines. In the year 1885, Henry met Clara Jane Bryant at a New Year's Eve party and got engaged the following year. As a wedding gift, Henry's father gave his son 40 acres of land, but rather than turning it into a farmland, Henry had other ideas. In 1891, Henry and Clara moved to a small apartment in Detroit. Around this time, Henry came across a British magazine and learned about the gas engine. This gas engine was being produced in small quantities by a German engineer called Nicholas Otto and was very different and far more efficient than steam engines. For one thing, they didn't need 30 minutes to start up because the engine did all the combustion it needed internally. Although this new engine was fast becoming really popular in Europe, only a few people had heard about it in America. Luckily enough for him, he found someone in the city who owned one. Henry immediately fell in love with the gas engine, but he couldn't understand how it worked, and the fact that the gas engine was powered up by an electric spark made things even worse. Knowing he had to learn more about this, Henry applied for work as a night engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company for a salary of $40 a month. At the time, the company was the biggest electric company in Detroit, and it was generating electricity to 1,000 homes in the city using a steam engine. So this made Henry more than qualified to work there. His job was to primarily fix the engine whenever it broke or developed a fault, but when it was working fine, he didn't have much else to do. This gave Henry more than enough time to immerse himself in learning about electricity and how it works. In 1893, Henry and Clara welcomed their first and only child, Edsel Bryant Ford, and just 3 months after his birth, Henry was promoted to the position of chief engineer at a salary of $100 per week. That same year, Henry succeeded in creating his first working gas engine, which was the first step in his dream of creating a horseless carriage. It wasn't until June 4, 1896, at exactly 1:30 a.m., when he finally completed his experimental car using a gas engine. He called it the quadricycle. The quadricycle was essentially a crude contraption that consisted of 2 bicycles placed side by side and was powered by a gasoline engine. While the experiment was successful, it had a few issues of its own. This experimental car had 2 gears, and neither one was for going in reverse or going forward. But the biggest problem was that it had no cooling system, and so the car was prone to overheating after running for a while. Henry made multiple adjustments to the car, but the most notable one was adding a cooling system to the vehicle. He later sold the vehicle for $200 and used the money for another big project. With the support of the Detroit mayor, Henry began to build his second experimental car and completed it by July 1899. This new car was larger, sturdier, and heavier than the previous one. One morning, Henry took a wealthy lumber merchant by the name of William Murphy for a test drive in his new vehicle. By the time the test drive was finished, William wanted to be part of Henry's business venture. And soon after, they shook hands together, and on August 5, 1899, the Detroit Automobile Company was born. Unfortunately, the company failed only a year later because of several reasons. Henry's ideas about improving the car he worked on were not in line with the stakeholders' ideas, who were pressuring him to make passenger cars. Another reason was because most of the parts that were required to make his cars were produced by different companies, and as a result of this, whenever a delivery was late, the whole factory had to sit back and wait for the delivery. This slowed production by a significant amount of time. His first car, which he called the delivery wagon, took 6 months to make, and only 20 of them were made during the company's first 2-year existence. As a result of all this, Henry was fired from his position. But even though his first company had failed, he remained optimistic. Failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently. Henry was actually relieved when he was sacked because there was less pressure on him, and now he could focus on other things. Henry decided to turn his attention to racing cars. The reason was simple. Racing cars had become a very popular sport in the United States, and Henry wanted a platform to showcase his cars and their quality. And besides, despite knowing a lot of very popular people in the city, not many of them would be willing to invest in his ideas after what happened with the Detroit Automobile Company. A year later, Ford's newly designed racing car defeated the vehicle of Cleveland automaker Alexander Winton, as well as the nation's leading national racing driver, Grosse Pointe. Henry's 26-horsepower vehicle became the talk of the town, and that kind of popularity gave investors the confidence they needed to back Henry the second time. The result was the birth of the Ford Motor Company, with Henry as the chief engineer. Not too long after, Henry's position was again hanging on a thin thread. The reason was because Henry continued to work making race cars, which infuriated his investors. They wanted him to create passenger cars they could sell to the masses, and so they brought in another Henry Martin Leland, to do their bidding. Ford was annoyed they'd brought in someone else to take over his place, and so he left the company. In his autobiography, Henry is quoted saying, "I resigned, determined never again to put myself under orders." Henry Leland, on the other hand, followed the wishes of his investors and went on to create what today we know as the Cadillac. With Henry Ford gone, the name of the company was changed from Ford Motor Company to the Cadillac Motor Company. Henry and a former racing cyclist by the name of Tom Cooper continued building racing cars. In 1902, they produced the Ford 999, an 80-horsepower car that was driven by Barney Oldfield, a former bicycle racer who had never driven an automobile in his life, surpassing Winton's car again. By 1904, Henry's new car broke all the American records, driving at a top speed of 91.4 miles per hour. With these records and victories, Henry had established himself as the best American designer for racing cars. With that kind of reputation, he knew he would be backed again by investors whenever he was ready to start up his third company. With the support and financial backing of 11 investors, especially a coal dealer from Detroit, Alexander Young Malcolmson, Henry's third company came to life. The company was initially called Ford and Malcolmson Limited, but was later changed to the Ford Motor Company in 1902. After failing in his first two attempts, he was determined not to fail again. Ford turned his attention to creating a vehicle that was affordable for the common man. You see, at the time, owning a vehicle was a luxury that could only be afforded by the wealthy ones. The reason being, these vehicles were made by extremely skilled engineers, and most of the cars made were strictly for racing. At the start of his new company, Henry made a statement to his associates and investors. "I will build a motor car for the great multitude, constructed of the best materials, by the best men to be hired, after the simplest designs that modern engineering can devise, so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one." Ford had a knack for identifying and attracting the brightest talents in the business. He hired many impressive young men who shared and believed in his vision. As for the design of the car, Henry made over 20 of them before he got one that finally worked. He called it the Model A. For the next 5 years, Henry kept improving the Model A, which was followed by the Model N. But in those 5 years, what really changed wasn't the improvements of his designs, but how they were being made. One of the things Henry learned from his failed businesses was the importance of having one manufacturer responsible for supplying most of the parts he needed to build his cars. And so, he found a machine shop in Detroit to do just that. One day, during a trip to Chicago, Henry witnessed the assembly line concept at a slaughterhouse, and that's when a bright idea came to him. If he could incorporate the same idea into building his cars, he could make more cars in a day. You see, at the time, Ford and many other car makers put together one car at a time, and the production was slow. So in 1904, Henry raised more money and built his own factory. He employed over 300 workers and began experimenting with the assembly line inside his new factory. It wasn't until 1906 when the production of the Model N would really first make use of the assembly line. But even then, the assembly line was still a work in progress. However, it did increase the level of production by 5 times, and his new model became the best-selling car in the US. But Henry had set his sights on even greater things. Henry built his own manufacturing company in 1905 to start making his own engines, transmissions, and everything else needed for the production of his cars. Around this time, Henry also discovered vanadium steel, and it was this discovery that really paved the way to a new era for the automobile industry. Vanadium steel was about 3 times stronger than the previous steel and much lighter. Henry used this new steel for his new model that would later become one of the most successful cars in human history, the Model T. A business absolutely devoted to service will have only one worry about profits: they will be embarrassingly large. Henry Ford dreamed of making automobiles for the common man and for everyday use, and the Model T was the answer to that dream. When it was first released, it was one of the most expensive cars Henry had ever made. The price for the Model T was set at $850, which would be something around $21,000 in today's currency. But despite its price, it quickly became a fan favorite in the US. In a matter of days after its release, 15,000 orders were placed, and the Ford Motor Company soon became the #1 car company in America. What else could he want? Henry realized he needed a bigger factory to produce over 100 Model Ts a day, and so, in 1910, he built a new plant in Highland Park, Michigan. After several experiments, the assembly line was officially in working order by 1913. This allowed work to be taken to the workers, rather than the workers moving in and around the vehicle. The vehicle was pulled down the line, building it step by step, and the new process reduced the time of production from 12 hours to 90 minutes. By 1914, their production rate of over 300,000 vehicles was more than all the cars produced by other car manufacturers combined. Between 1910 to 1916, the number of Model Ts being produced moved from 20,000 to almost 1 million. By then, about half of all the cars on Earth were Fords. Henry had another brilliant game plan that would make him stand out in the automobile market. Every year, the number of the Model T's production output increased, so he reduced the price of the car. In fact, by 1916, the price of the Model T that once sold for $850 was now selling for less than $400. But that wasn't the only brilliant strategy Henry adopted. You see, despite Henry pioneering the age of the automobile in America with the assembly line, a lot of his workers weren't happy with this innovation. Many workers found doing the same thing over and over again boring, and the skilled craftsmen among them found their new job insulting, as they were tasked with just 2 duties instead of building a whole car. As a result, workers began to leave Ford to work for other companies. To combat this, Henry doubled the workers' wage, raising it to $5 a day. Many companies laughed at this move, believing it would quickly bankrupt the company, but it did the opposite. Mechanics from all over the country flew to Detroit in search of higher wages. We believe in making 25,000 men prosperous and contented, rather than following the plan of making a few slave drivers in our multi-millionaire establishments. Not only did Henry Ford increase the wages of the mechanics who now work for him, but he also gave them an hour off from the number of hours they were required to work. The change in shift allowed Ford to hire a new set of workers for a 3rd shift and create a 24-hour operation. Soon enough, many other car businesses had to do the same, in fear of losing their workers to Ford. Henry had changed the business and manufacturing world across the USA. There is one rule for the industrialist, and that is, make the best quality goods possible, at the lowest cost possible, paying the highest wages possible. In 1919, Henry Ford grew tired of the interference from other investors in the company and decided to buy them all out. The result was several millionaires in Detroit, but it also made Henry Ford the sole owner of the largest automobile company in the world. Later, Henry made Edsel Ford, his 26-year-old son, the president of his company, but it was Henry who really ran the show. However, absolute power over the company came with a price that even the richest man in America couldn't ignore. Henry continued to believe the Model T was the car most people wanted. He ignored the growing popularity of the more expensive but stylish and comfortable cars like Chevrolet. Being the stubborn and stiff-necked man that he was, he refused to listen to other Ford executives or even his own son, Edsel, when they said it was time for a new model. By the late 1920s, Henry could no longer ignore the declining sales figures, so he finally decided to shut down the Model T assembly line and began designing an all-new car. The new Model A was released in 1927, but this new car was no longer produced at Highland Park, but at a bigger factory along the Rogue River in Michigan. In his new factory, Henry wanted to include all the steps involved in the manufacturing process, from refining raw materials to the final assembly of the automobile. which he accomplished. It became the world's largest factory, making. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to like the video and subscribe if you enjoyed.
We knew so little about the variety store business that we...
And the second rule on investment is don't forget the first rule, and that's all the rules there are. I mean, if you buy things for far below what they're worth, and you... Thank you all for watching. Make sure to subscribe and like the video. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.
We knew so little about the variety store business that we had to take the book that was written by Ben Franklin and apply the principles. But of course, we added on, didn't we? And we started doing strange things like cranking up ice cream machines on the sidewalk on Saturday night, running popcorn on the other end of the sidewalk.
In 1879, a 16-year-old boy left his father's
We knew so
farm.
little about the variety store business that we had to take the book that was written by Ben Franklin and apply the principles. But of course, we added on, and we started doing strange things like cranking up ice cream machines on the sidewalk on Saturday night, running popcorn on the other end of the sidewalk, hawking anything we could hawk on that looked like it might have a chance to sell.
So sit back and relax. By then, many